Hey, so when I first started photography over 12 years ago, one of the most fundamental skills that I had to learn in order to actually take photographs was understanding the concept of exposure and how that translates into a camera. Now, for most beginners, or most people, most photographers would probably have seen this thing. This is the exposure triangle. However, for many, many years, and even when I first started, it really didn't make much sense to me because the diagram, for my head anyways, seemed difficult to comprehend how to truly balance the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture to kind of get this, perfect exposure representation somewhere in the middle of the triangle. So I just kind of took it as kind of face value and said, okay, well, to get a perfect exposure, I just need to essentially have a balance between the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, and that's essentially how I began my journey. However, over the years, I guess I realized that while the exposure triangle is very useful, and don't get me wrong, I think it's very useful, there is an easier way to understand and to kind of practically translate the concept of good exposure into a more digestible way. And when I saw this video from John P. Hess and from Filmmakers IQ, I really understood at that point that what he was talking about was exactly how I interpreted it, but just not been able to, I guess, say it or explain it. So in this video, we're going to talk about how you should think about exposure in a fundamentally different way, stop thinking about it from an exposure triangle perspective, and start to see it from the pathway of light from the outside of your camera all the way through to the inside of your camera. So that's a big topic, but I think it's going to be very good. Let's get into it. But before we get into the video, if I earn your sub and like in the next few minutes by giving you some good information, then please consider subscribing and liking this video. I would greatly appreciate it. My goal is to hit 1,000 subscribers and build a great community of image makers here on YouTube. So let's finally talk about this topic. So to kind of illustrate the point that I'm trying to make, what I'm going to do is I'm going to practically show you and explain how the pathway of light, the thinking of pathway of light, to me is much easier than trying to comprehend the exposure triangle. Now, let's go a little bit deeper into exposure triangle for a second, just in case people are new. And if you are new, thank you for tuning in. And I hope this explanation, even though it's simple, helps you in understanding the next concept that we're going to talk about. So the exposure triangle essentially stipulates that somewhere in the middle is perfect exposure. And the perfect exposure is a balance between ISO, shutter speed, sorry, I'm pointing at different, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Which means if a certain part of your setting, for example, aperture, makes the image darker, the shutter speed and the ISO has to compensate in some way, shape, or form. And in the other parts, it remains true. If, for example, ISO makes the image darker or brighter, both the shutter speed and aperture has to compensate. And finally, just so I can complete the triangle, if the shutter makes the image darker or lighter, both the ISO and the shutter and the aperture has to compensate in some way to bring the exposure back to perfect exposure. Now, as a beginner, though, if you think about that, it kind of perplexes because if you're still new to understanding the concept of exposure, you're like, okay, well, so which one do I set first, right? Which one do I set first? Shutter, aperture, ISO. And so if I change the ISO, how do I then change the shutter and then and etc. And I think that's where majority of the confusion comes. So I'm going to bring in my camera right here. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to, hopefully my camera over here, hello, my face is right here. So going back, so let's finally take the concept and essentially use this camera as an illustration of what I'm trying to talk about. Now let's go through some fundamentals first, right? Let's go through the fundamentals. Here on this side we have a camera system. Now, the camera system is comprised of the body, right, which has your sensor. In front of the sensor, you have your shutter. In front of your shutter, you have a lens or your aperture. And then in front of the lens, you can have an optional filter that you can screw on. And there's a number of different filters that you can screw on in the front of your lens. Now, this is my hand, and my hand is reflecting light that the sun is giving off. Now, the reason why a camera system can capture an image is because that light rays bounces off an object, for example, my hand, it travels through the camera system, and then it finally rests on, the light rests onto the sensor, which then gets digitized and then saved onto a memory card. Now, that is a very simple explanation for the pathway of light. But why is it so much more powerful than understanding it via the exposure triangle? Well, because if we go back and use that same example again, then we can actually comprehend how individually it affects our image when we take the photo. So now that we understand that, so this is our camera system, this is the light that's reflected, the object that reflects light. So if you were to hit the shutter right now, the light would have to go through first a filter, an ND filter right here, which can increase or decrease the amount of light. Currently, I have what we call a neutral density filter, which means it is a filter that blocks light through. Now, we're not going to get into like the nitty-gritty of ND filters, but just keep that in mind. This filter stops, you can control how much light gets through it, okay? And then now after the ND filter, we have the aperture. So open and close. The bigger the aperture, the more light, the less aperture, the less light. So you control the light on the aperture. And then the light goes through and hits or goes through the shutter. And your shutter speed dictates how much light gets past the shutter as it opens and closes inside your camera body. And then finally, the light, after going through all of those entire system, hits the sensor. And when it hits the sensor, your ISO determines how much amplification of that signal you're going to apply to that light. Now, let me just quickly talk about a misconception that I see all the time. People saying that ISO changes the sensitivity of your sensor. It doesn't. Okay, a sensor has one general sensitivity, and that's the sensitivity that the manufacturer, Sony, Canon, whatever, sets the sensor to. The ISO is whatever that sensitivity is an amplification from that sensitivity. Okay, so essentially, if let's say you let in, I'm just going to use an abstract number. Let's say out of 10 units of light, right? We only let 1 unit of light in. Your ISO will try to amplify that 1 unit of light and essentially make it seem like the light that went in was like, let's say you double it, you would have 2 units of light. But the problem with that is similar to, for example, turning up the gain on an audio device. Have you ever heard, if you've ever used a microphone before, if you turn up the gain of the microphone, you hear this that hissing sound? That's what they call the noise floor of a microphone. The noise floor of a sensor is the same thing. When you are cranking up the ISO, you are essentially turning up that gain, and even though you're going to get a louder volume from the microphone, right, you're also increasing the amount of noise from that noise floor. So for a camera, even though you're bumping up the ISO, you are essentially amplifying the signal that your sensor is getting, but by doing so, you're also increasing where that noise floor is. And that's why if you use a high ISO to take a photograph, you have less dynamic range and you have more noise. Is that good? Is that bad? Inherently, neither. It's a tool at the end of the day. There's a purpose for using high ISO and there's a purpose for using low ISO. If you want to see a video on that in the future, give this video a like and a subscribe, and we can talk about that in the future. Cool. So, a lot of information, right? We've just gone through how light bounces off my hand through there. Now, let's take it one step further. Suppose that the light that the sun is giving off is 10 units, okay? Now, none of this, we're gonna just treat this as abstract. The sun on a broad daylight, no cloud, is giving off 10 units of light. Now let's just say your camera sensor, right, needs around about 5 units of light for proper exposure, which means if it's more than 5 units of light, it's going to be overexposed and 10 is white. Like if the sensor receives 10 units of light, it's just white across the board. And if it's 0, then it's completely black. Okay, so let's just use that as our measure. So if your camera system requires 5 units of light, 10 units of light hits my hand and now it's going into the camera system. Now we can start to use our knowledge of the camera system to balance all of that sequentially. So let's go through it slowly. ND filter, 10 units of light. Let's use the ND filter to decrease it by 1 unit. So that's 9 units now. The aperture, let's crank up the aperture so that we decrease it by another 2 units of light. So that's 3 total that we've decreased from 10. So that's 7. Now we use the shutter to reduce it to 5 by reducing it by 2 more units of light. That's now 5. So by that point, we don't even need to touch our ISO. We can leave it at our base 100 ISO because the system in front of the sensor can compensate properly for the amount of light that it needs to reduce. Now, that is as simple as it gets. The cool thing about that understanding is that most people, when you see the exposure triangle, they'll go, okay, how do I balance ISO, shutter speed, and aperture? But in that example, we don't even need to think about ISO for the moment because we have enough light and we can deal with that amount of light in the camera system in front of the sensor. Now let's flip it around a bit. Let's just say it's dark, right? Let's just say that we have, let's say we have 3 units of light out here, bouncing off 3 units of light. Obviously, let's go through this again. Now, would we need an ND filter? No. Why? Because the ND filter is going to reduce the amount of light. So let's screw this off and let's not even think about having an ND filter in front of our camera. Let's get rid of that so we don't even need to think about that. Now, when the aperture is, let's say, as brightest as we get, don't get any reduction of light, but we don't get a lot more we don't get more light because we can't create light from aperture. So from aperture, we still have 3 units, 5 units is perfect exposure. We just leave the aperture as wide as it gets. And then we go to the shutter, right? Let's say the shutter, because we can't really go super low, right? We'll probably go, let's say 1/50th of a second. Let's just say that, which reduces, let's say, the light by 1. Okay, so now we have 2 units of light by the time that we get this to the sensor. So what do? Now we have to amplify the signal that's coming in using our ISO. And we do that so that we can amplify it to 5 units of light. So now, we know that we'll try, when we take that photo, we just leave the aperture at the widest possible aperture. We just take it at the slowest shutter speed that we can have in order for us to not have motion blur or handling blur. And then we have to amplify the signal using the ISO on our camera. So we can't use 100 ISO. We may have to use 200, 400, 800, 1600 in order for us to bring that exposure, that unit of light, back into usable perfect exposure. See how it's much easier than thinking about it from a triangle? Because now you actually understand how the system plays its part. Okay, last example. Let's get one last more complicated kind of example here. Suppose it is a dark environment. We have the 3 units of light. We're trying to take a picture of landscape, right? So landscape, we want to essentially have a big amount of depth of field. So depth of field, we know, is how much the distance of something being sharp, right? Shallow depth of field is when you have like your aperture wide open, like f1.4, f1.18, where you get that blurry bokeh, similar to what you're seeing now. And a higher aperture increases your depth of field, so that when you use higher aperture, you get a much wider depth where the image is sharp. So let's suppose that you're taking landscape. You want everything to be tack sharp, from like your foreground all the way through to the infinite background. So you may want to take your aperture and set it to f4 instead of f1.4, f1.8. So now let's use that same example. You only have 3 units of light, and then you want to set your aperture to f4 because you want to create the biggest depth of field. You want to use the sharpest portion of your lens, and let's not get into that, but essentially, okay, let's not get into that. That'll complicate things. You want f4 to essentially create a great amount of depth of field, and that, by doing that, you're decreasing the unit of light by, let's say, 3, okay? So you're going from 3 units of light to -3, which is 0, right? So it's very, very dark. But there's still light in the ambient, but because of your aperture, you've just reduced the amount of light that is essentially that you're getting. So how do we deal with that? We have the choice of dealing with it from the next line, which is the shutter speed, or do we deal with it on the ISO? Let's think about it. Maybe we can deal with it on the ISO level. Crank that baby up. So you would have a little bit of light, and then you would have to crank it up all the way through to maybe 12,800 ISO. You will have a very grainy image. That could be okay. That could be cool. Maybe you like that. That's fine. But also, here's the thing. Because we have the 2 choices, we have the shutter speed and then the ISO. That example was just dealing with the ISO. Let's now look at it from a shutter speed perspective. Could I put it on a tripod and then open up that shutter so that we can absorb as much light as possible from the ambient? So the shutter, essentially, because it stays open, you know, and it's on a tripod, it's not wiggling, it's not moving, so you're not getting the blurring of your image. Let's open it for 5 seconds. So essentially what happens is you go from 3 with an f4 lens to 0, opening up that shutter for, let's say, 5 seconds, which gives you, let's say, 5 units of light, right? We're just hypothetical. 5 units of light from the shutter speed. And then now, do we need to deal with it from an ISO level? No, because you've set your shutter speed to be open on you've set your camera on a tripod. You have essentially opened up you've opened up your shutter to let the amount of light in that you need to get good exposure. So because you have 5 units of light from the setting of your shutter speed, you don't need to change your ISO. Your ISO can stay at ISO 100. How cool is that? So that is kind of like it's not very quick, is it? I don't know how long this video has been going, but essentially I wanted to get through those 3 scenarios so that I can kind of demonstrate that thinking about it from a pathway of light perspective, to me, is much more powerful than thinking about it from that triangle perspective, because the triangle doesn't really show you how light travels through to your sensor. And when you don't, for me anyways, when I didn't understand that, I kind of just used it as like not even a reference. I kind of just absorbed it as like, yeah, I kind of know the exposure triangle, but if I were to try to use it practically, I don't really know how I can translate that, especially from a beginner level. So now that we've explained the pathway of light, isn't that so cool? Now you can think about when you're holding your camera, now when you're going out and taking photos, you can think to yourself, okay, I'm about to take a photo. It's a afternoon, not much light, okay? So if there's not much light, do I have a filter on? No, I don't have a filter on, so we don't need to worry about that. There's no modification of light there. Because there's not a lot of light, then do I need to keep my aperture as wide as I possibly can? Yeah, I guess I can. I have to, because then if I leave that open, then I can compensate with my shutter speed so that I don't get people blurring in the foreground, the background when they move just a small amount, because your aperture is letting enough light in through to your shutter so that you can actually deal with the motion blur from a shutter perspective. But let's say there's really isn't a lot of light. So if my aperture and my shutter is not enough, then let's crank up the ISO just a little bit. Let's increase that ISO so that we can amplify whatever light we have and actually get a usable image. That's pretty cool. So let's leave it there. I think that's as good as I'm gonna get in terms of explaining that concept. But if you have any questions about this, then hit me up in the comments and let me know, did this actually change your thinking about how you think about exposure? If it did, I'm so stoked, because I've spoken to so many photographers out there. And when we're talking about exposure, especially the more beginner ones, they know of the concept, but they haven't developed yet the finesse on using it on a practical term. And when you understand the differences between the shutter, the ISO, what they do, right, and then the ISO and what that does, then you can actually make informed choices on how you're going to shoot your image. And then you can be more creative, and then you can have more fun. And that's what we're all about. So I'm gonna finish right there. If this video was useful to you in any way, shape, or form, and you feel like you wanna support my channel and the growth to become a great community in image makers here on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, share it with your friends. If you really hated it, send it to 10 of your hated enemies, and I'm sure they're gonna hate it as well. So I can guarantee you. Until next time, I hope you're having a great day. Take some images. I'll see you next time. Peace.